And welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 99. Today we're going to be looking at ISO, often referred to as the kind of third pillar of photography. You have shutter speed, ISO, and aperture as the three aspects of the bits that kind of allow you to control light exposure, the amount of light that's kind of falling on the sensor, and what's going to happen with it when it does. So that's really the bit we're going to talk about. Also, Rosemary's put in a photo for critique, so we're going to take a little bit of a look at that later as well. We're here live on YouTube. Let me know you're here, leave a comment, tell me what the weather's like, tell me where you're from. So here we are live on YouTube, and sorry, suddenly distracted there by not totally sure what was coming up on the screen. Yeah, here we are live on YouTube, as you can tell. I can see we've got a couple of comments in already. Melissa says hi from North Carolina. Welcome, Melissa. Really glad you could make it along. Jackie says hello there. Another hot day from South Africa. Robert says howdy all from Texas. Meg says good afternoon everyone. Pat says cold here in Somerset. Greetings all. And Maggie says beautiful sunny day in Castle Douglas, which it is indeed. And in fact, for anybody who is kind of really notices these things, which probably isn't that many to be honest. However, the lighting here might look slightly different to the way it usually does, because normally over in that direction I've got a light sitting on which kind of generally gives me this sort of, but today it is so sunny that I'm actually just using window light, which is pretty rare. So I've not, there has been a couple of sunny Sundays before now, except for the fact that because we're in the northern hemisphere and it's winter, the sun disappears and I knew it would get dark later. But today I've just got the blinds open, so natural light coming in from the side. What else have we got? Oh, the Bevs. Karen says tuning in and saying hi. Pat also says ISO used to be short for isolation in hospital. Right? Yeah, I think ISO is one of these little abbreviations that can stand for quite a few different things. Just briefly, I will say that ISO in photography refers to International Organization for Standardization, which basically nobody ever remembers and doesn't really make a great deal of sense to what it is. But we'll come back to that. Rosemary says, good morning. Funny one, Pat. Greetings from Washington State. John says, hello, Kim and everyone from a warm Columbus, Ohio. Diane says, hi Kim, the sun has just come out here. That's great. And April says, hello everyone from a warmish cloudy day in Long Island, New York. Well, this is great. We have people in, we've got people commenting. So let's start talking about the notion of ISO. So in essence, like I say, when you decide that you are going to move on to the manual settings with your photography, there are primarily three things you can do to adjust the brightness and darkness and amount of light hitting the sensor. The first is shutter speed. So you can control how fast the shutter opens and closes again, the timing of that, which is the amount of light that comes in. So the best analogy I ever heard, I think, is it's a bit like, imagine then you were opening and closing a tap or a faucet in order to just quickly fill a bowl or put a layer of water onto a tray. So shutter speed is like how long do you open the tap for. The longer you open the tap for, the more water comes through, right? So in camera terms, that's like the longer your shutter speed, the more available light comes in and hits the sensor. Now aperture is the equivalent of the width of the tap. If you had a wider, bigger tap, then you would, for the same amount of time, you would let much more water in. Or if you had a really small tap, over the same amount of time, not as much water would get through. So likewise with your aperture in photography, the wider your aperture, the more light gets in. The narrower your aperture, the less of that light gets in within a given time period. So most of the time, what we're trying to balance up is how wide we have our aperture with how long we have the shutter open for. But the third aspect to this, the third pillar, is is ISO. Now, in this analogy, probably the best way to use that is the idea of think of a mesh. Think of a mesh going across the tap. That's actually essentially almost like creating a kind of a purity filter, right? Now, the tighter the mesh, if you like, the smaller the holes in the mesh, the lower the ISO, the less water gets through, but the purer it is, the cleaner it is. If you have a really wide mesh, then more water gets through, but so do all the impurities. So in a way, that's as an analogy, the smaller your ISO number, the kind of purer the light, the cleaner the photograph is. Now, when you're in a low light situation and you've already made your aperture as wide as you can, you've gone as slow as you can with your shutter speed, the other way of getting more light to hit the sensor is to have a wider or bigger number ISO. But essentially, it's not really letting in impurities, but in this analogy, essentially what it means is the quality degrades. So the quality of a high ISO image isn't as good as the quality of a low ISO image. So when should you be using it? How do you counteract it? That's what we're going to be talking about. So this all kicked off because last week Rosemary sent me a message saying, as a third leg of the exposure triangle, ISO and its post-production cousins to address noise issues is the one that tends to get glossed over in basic instructions. The advice I've always heard is very confusing or conflicting. So one piece of advice you always hear is always use the very lowest ISO you can. But then another piece of advice says newer digital cameras are so capable that you don't actually have to worry about ISO so much. Somebody else says it's actually the amount of light hitting the sensor that determines the noise, not the ISO. Somebody else said you can always tweak the noise a bit in post-production, although I've yet to hear how. And somebody else said noise is something you can't clean up in post-production. Brightening the exposure too much in it is in unacceptable amounts of noise. So what we can see here is that there's a whole load of different, almost conflicting ideas of kind of what you can do about it, because in essence what we're talking about is the higher, like I say, the higher the ISO, it allows you to shoot in lower light situations, but you end up with noise getting involved. Now, if we remember, the digital noise, kind of the equivalent of, although people will argue against it completely, film grain. Back in the days of analog, back in the days when you buy different films, you would buy a higher ISO film which would allow you to shoot in lower light, but it would have a much grainier texture to it. So, okay, now I think probably the best thing to do here is show you some examples. So what I'm going to talk about first of all, or show you then, is what I did was I just set up, I decided I would take a quick photo and just randomly hoping to be able to get hold of something. I took this photo of my little mannequin, who's normally sitting over my right shoulder on your left as you look at the screen. I put him holding a piece of coal, standing in front of the log burner stove. Now, no, don't worry, I'm not planning on throwing the mannequin on the stove, but just as so. Now, the reason I kind of took it here is because the room in which this is in is downstairs. It's low. There's not a lot of light gets in to this. So this photo here, taking at a 100 ISO, so nice, clean, pure photograph. I took it at f4.5, so 4.5 aperture, so not as wide as it could have gone. I could have gone a bit wider, except for the fact that I wanted to have a little bit of depth in it. But it took 10 seconds. It took 10 seconds to take this exposure in order to get the balance of the light. And part of the problem with 10 seconds is I didn't have it on a tripod. Now, I wasn't holding it by hand, but I did have it sitting on a little table, coffee table, sitting on a beanbag. And actually, 10 seconds was enough that the wobble meant that if we zoom in here, you can kind of see it's not quite in focus. There's these little bits around here where it's just wobbled a little bit at the point it's gone click. Even though I set it on a 2-second timer, it hasn't worked. So there are times when if something is, certainly if something is likely to be moving, that you don't have the option to have a slow, really slow shutter speed. So what do you do? So let me show you what's going to happen. What I want to, so what I did is, let's show you what happens if I take this at 100 ISO, 4.5, 20th of a second, right? So I've got it at 100 ISO, 1/20th of a second. Now, not 20 seconds, but 1/20th of a second. And so 20th of a second is fine for the setup that I had with the camera sitting on a beanbag. But at 100 ISO, we can't see anything. We can barely see. I think I can zoom right in. Depending on how bright your screen is, you might just make out the faintest of faintest bits. But for most of you, it's probably going to be completely black. So that's no good. 100 ISO isn't going to give us the light we need. I've got it as maybe as slow as I dare go. Perhaps I don't want to go lower than 20th of a second. I've got it as wide as I want to go. I don't want to go wider than a 4.5. So what am I going to do? So let's go then. So what if I up the ISO to 400? So click on this, and now perhaps a few more of you can start to see that it's starting to appear, but it's still pretty dark, not making out a lot going on there. So let's go up then to 1600 ISO. Right now at 1600 ISO, we're now starting to get a bit of, we can kind of see the figure. It's nowhere near as bright as that original one coming in, but we can see it, but we can also see quite a bit of noise really in here as well. But anyway, we can see a bit of it, but it's not bright enough for what we want. So now I'm going to double it again, 3200 ISO. So click on this and we're getting brighter again. 6400 ISO. We're now starting to move into the realms where we're kind of, but it's still a bit darker. It's still not up to where we were before. So now I'm absolutely maxing out on my camera, and I've gone up to 12,800 ISO. And at 12,800 ISO, finally, we have the image that we want. And if I open that, now we've got, this is the brightness that I wanted. However, when I zoom in on this, I'm hoping that you'll see it on whatever size screen you've got, it is intensely noisy. And that's part of the problem, is that whilst the, if we go back to this one, which was taken at a 100 ISO with a 10-second exposure, we don't have the noise, but it's not properly in focus. So what we're trying to do is find that balance between getting it in focus and being able to, and not having it too noisy. But if we go back to, let's go back to here. Now, one of the things I really want to talk about here is the notion of, because sometimes people will say, is it better to have a low ISO and then in post-production lighten it up, or are you better off shooting at a high ISO to begin with? So this is a really important point, because let's go back to, for a moment, let's go back to this one, which is a 100 ISO. Right? Now, if I take the exposure and I push that up, we can see that I can actually bring out some detail. Now, even though I've got this whacked up to the max here, you can't. It's still darker than I want. So maybe I have to push the whites up. I have to push the highlights up, bring the shadows up, bring the blacks up. Kind of as much as I can, I'm pushing everything up in order to get it as bright as I want. Now, let's open that. And when we look at this, it's extraordinarily noisy. And although it's now the sort of same brightness as this one, so let's just move that back out and put that there so we can kind of compare them side by side. You can see that the quality of the 100 ISO that's been brought up is far worse. So if I pull that into there, as opposed to pull that into there. And you can see that although 12,800 is very high ISO, making it very noisy, it's nothing like as bad as when you go to 100 and pull that up to that. Well, let's take another one. So let's even say, well, okay, what if I did the 3,200? So the 3,200, again, too dark. So I pull the exposure up to just something like that, should probably do. Is that going to be as good as? So let's pull that up to the same kind of size we've been talking about and compare that. Well, certainly it's better than when it was at 100, but even to the 1200, no, the 1200 is still better than, the 12,000. The 12,800 ISO is still a better quality image than the 3,200 ISO boosted by in post-production. You know, that though it's not bad, and like I say, certainly better than 100, it's still not quite as good as this. So that's really the bit that I'm kind of wanting to answer that question on. That this notion of, should you always use the lowest ISO you can? You know, and as your starting point, yes. You want to try and make sure that you can go to use your purest that you can. Whatever your cameras, you know, for some cameras, they even could go as low as 50 ISO, but certainly 100 ISO is what you're aiming for. But what happens then if you need a certain level of shutter speed? So what, you know, supposing you're actually taking a photograph of something moving, and if you've got a low shutter speed, it's just going to be blurred. Because it's also important that you have maybe, if you're trying to capture an athlete in midair, if you're trying to catch a bird flapping its wings at a bird feeder, it's really important that you get this sharp. You don't want it so blurred that you can't make out what it is you're looking at. So at that point, if you've already got the shutter speed as slow as you want to go, and you've got your aperture as wide as you want to go, that's the point you then start knocking up the ISO. So start off with a low ISO and then start building it up after you've got everything else as best as you can. And that's really the kind of priority you want. Okay, I can see a couple more comments have come in, so let's take a look at this. Okay, Jim's joined us from a sunny Dumfries. Stacey has found out she's got a D7-100 is a crop camera, cannot get a full frame. Getting a wide angle would not work well. I may have to invest in getting a full frame camera. What is your take? Okay, slightly different question, but actually, I'll tell you what, Stacey, that's going to kind of take me off on too much of a tangent just now. Remind me a bit later, and I'll maybe come back to that a bit later in the programme, or it's something I can look at for next week or the week after. About the difference between crop cameras and full frame cameras, and when it's an advantage to have either. So let's pull back to the ISO for the moment. April says, I think this idea was clever. Okay, Rose is giving Stacey some advice there. Pat's wondering where the word noise originated with regard to photography. I think the thing is that there's always a certain amount of crossover with senses. Sometimes it's like we'll talk about somebody with a loud shirt, and what we mean, we know what we mean when somebody says, "Oh, that they were wearing a loud shirt." Or that you can smell the fear on someone. You can't literally smell the fear, but you can sense, you can pick up other things. The shirt is bright, but that sense of that when we often kind of play around with other things. There's also, in the notion, in sound, if you are there's signal to noise, there's the notion of, so if supposing you've got an electric guitar and you plug your guitar in, how much of that signal is pure guitar, and how much, the longer the cable, the poorer quality the cable, the poorer quality the connection, you end up with more interference, static noise, hiss, building its way into the sound. So I think very often there's been a kind of crossover, essentially. So noise is just another kind of synesthetic way of sort of saying, it's kind of a bit messy. So hope that answers that one for you, Pat. So where was I? Yeah, so talking then about the idea of essentially your priority then is always to get the cleanest image you want, you start off with a low ISO. But then you're up against the idea of there's no point in having a clean image if it's not in focus. And it's not so. Or it's blurry. Now, it could be blurry because your shutter speed wasn't far enough, or it could be blurry because your aperture was just so wide that you had a narrow depth of field and the thing you were taking a photograph of moved in or out slightly and you weren't able to get the bit that you wanted. So you need to make sure you take your aperture as wide as you need to for the shot you're going for. You need to be at a shutter speed high enough for the shot you're going for. And then if it's still too dark, at that point you start upping your ISO. So I hope that makes sense. If you end up with a high ISO shot, which is just kind of looking a bit too noisy, what can you do about it? Well, if we flip back to Photoshop here, so let's go back to our little mannequin head here, and we've got this on 12,800. Now it is, as we can see, rather noisy. Now, something to bear in mind, first of all, is how is this photo going to be displayed? Because when I've shrunk it in like this, on your screen, even on my screen here, it looks okay. The noise isn't that obvious. I'm not overly aware of it. However, if I was to print this up, to a nice kind of A3, A4, A2 size or something like that, then all this noise would be clearly visible. So if you're actually only ever going to be showing this on your computer, posting it on Facebook, posting it on Instagram, then you don't actually have to worry too much. But if you're ever planning on printing it up, you are going to have to worry. The other thing to remember is how much you're going to edit the photo, because every time we edit the photo, it degrades the photo to a certain, well, depending on how much editing we do, it can degrade the photo as well. So if you're starting off with an already slightly degraded image, then that degradation multiplies very, very quickly. So supposing we do want to smooth this up a bit, are there very many options? Well, what I can do here, I'll just copy that layer. So let's just go back quickly into Camera Raw, because in here, let's zoom in, there's a slider here. If we go to, there's a bit that says detail, and I can do sharpening, which actually might make it a little bit sharper, but you can see makes the noise worse. Or I can do noise reduction. Now noise reduction essentially starts to blur it. So we're removing the noise, and sometimes you get a bit of color noise in there, so I'll just take that out. And if I take this color reduction up, this noise reduction up like this, then when we zoom back in, it's not as noisy as it was. It's blurred it a bit. But the problem is with blurring it a bit is we can lose some of the sharpness to it as well. So let's try this another way. If I go to say filter blur, if I just let's go to Gaussian or Gaussian blur, and I just keep upping that, and you can see if I go up to here, I've lost all the noise. We don't have the noise anymore, except for the fact that it's now out of focus. So this is kind of, and the less blurry I make it to get it sharper, the more noise is still within the photo. Now there are some things in here in the blur you'll have smart blur. So here it will do things whereby we can kind of change the radius and it will look out for certain bits and pieces. Now actually nothing much is happening here with this. More noticeable when you're looking on a face. I'll tell you what, I'll just scrap that one. But there are other options when you go to filter. You've got smart blur, you've got surface blur, you've got shape radius. There's all sorts of different ways you can do it. So you can blur the image, or you can selectively blur the image, or you can try the noise reduction things in your post-production. So there are ways you can do it to an extent, but you've always, ideally, you want to have the lowest ISO in the first place, so you don't have to really do that, because they are always a compromise. But again, depending on your priority, always what you're talking about is how you decide to prioritize. What's the most important? Like I said, there's no point in having it really nice, smooth ISO if it's out of focus, if you didn't manage to capture the image you wanted. Better to have a high I mean, supposing you're at a rodeo and there's chance you're going click, 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 and you see somebody flying off the horse. You want to catch them in midair. Better to have a high ISO and a sharp photo than to have, you know, a low ISO, clear, you know, smooth photo. If that's out of focus, that didn't capture the moment. So this is kind of what your balance is up against. So I hope this kind of makes sense. Now, another thing you can do is sometimes you can kind of drop things into black and white. Now, in the case of this, it doesn't work quite so well, but let me show you something here where let's take a picture of a musician. Because very often, if you're photographing bands in pubs or in bands are very often playing in low light conditions. And this particular photo took many years ago. This is where I've got it at an 80th of a second, and I didn't dare go lower than an 80th of a second because people are moving, and I'm still at this point trying to get to the point whereby they're holding still for a fraction of a moment when I go click. So I've managed to get him kind of more or less sharp enough, but I'm on a wide aperture. I'm on 2.8 with my aperture. So there's not a lot of give here. And actually, partly whether I've kind of really got it, I've kind of just about caught him in focus, but it's a close thing. You can see this end, you know, that part of the microphone's okay. This part of the microphone is already going out. You've got a very narrow depth of field with that. But because I'm at 6400 ISO, the noise is terrible. So what can I do about this? And one of the things you can do about this is you can put it in black and white. So if I duplicate that for a moment, and this is going back to the idea of what I was talking about in old film. Now, if we put it in black and white, now the problem is just desaturating it tends to make it look very flat. So as we talked before about the idea with black and white, if you are going to go black and white, then you quite often, let's play with contrast, or maybe bring the exposure up a bit, make that a bit brighter, push the contrast up a bit more, looks a bit more interesting, maybe give it a little bit of a vignette, something like that, and maybe I'll push the clarity a little bit. We do something like that. Now I click OK, and what I'll also do is I'll just get rid of that little bit of light that was on the ceiling in the background. And that looks kind of a bit cool. That looks cooler than that does. And part of it, we although it's still a very noisy picture, it started to look more like grain. It started to look more like we remember the black and white photos from the music press. Because back in the days of analog, they were using high ISO film. And so the photos were always grainy when we look. So we can kind of get away with it in black and white in a way that doesn't really work in colour. So very often, if you're stuck with a really high ISO situation, turning it to black and white can be one of those ways of getting around it, and you kind of have a little bit of artistic license. Doesn't always give you a get out of jail free card, but you'd be surprised how often it does in fact work. I'll show you another example taken from the same gig in a small pub. So we have this, again, let's just get rid of that little light in the corner. And it's quite dark, it's not really working too well. So take the camera raw filter, up the exposure, yeah, but we are, again, you can see there's a lot of noise in here, which isn't that great. Let's just bring those highlights down a bit because the exposure's blown the highlights in the hair there. The colour's a bit naff as well, so again, go to desaturate, play with the contrast a little bit, maybe even you could even up the exposure even a little bit more on that. It could be kind of fun. Play with the clarity, take the highlights down a fraction, and now we have again a kind of perfectly acceptable band photo. So that band playing live in your local bar is there's an acceptability to have a certain amount of noise in the photos because we're so used to seeing that. So hopefully then that gives you some idea. So when you're essentially then your options when you have too much noise is either you try some of these things like noise reduction in your software, which might, even if it doesn't do it completely, might help a bit. Certainly explore. Most editing softwares, Photoshop has a lot of different versions. There are other ones around. They all have noise reduction facilities. Play with them and see what they get. But if you start getting to a point whereby it sort of goes into this sort of weird, smooth kind of yuckiness, you've kind of gone too far. And then another option, depending on the kind of photo you're doing, black and white can often allow you to get away with it. However, remember, as we've talked before about ways to convert to black and white, just taking the saturation slider, moving it to the left and desaturating very often leaves you with a very flat image. So if you're going to desaturate, you also very often have to play with your contrasts as well in order to bring some life back into it. Okay, couple more comments here. Rosemary says, thanks Kim, this is really helpful info on your ISO. Excellent, glad that makes sense of the conflicting advice floating around on the web. Melissa says, last rodeo I shot was a noise storm, awful images, we'll try black and white, thanks. Excellent. Right, okay, so hopefully then that's given you some ideas, and what we'll do is we'll move on. Just to let you know, if you are finding these podcasts useful, interesting, entertaining, you would like to support them in some way, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is certainly one of the ways you can do that. Another way you can help is to invite your friends. Let's grow this community of ours. Okay, so with that in mind, let's... next bit, a little stage here. I generally have a question of the week, which I put into the Facebook group. And this week what I asked everybody was, when you were a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up? And did you become it? Or what did you end up doing instead? Now, we had, well, first of all, thanks to Claire, John Painter, Diane, Nuria, Stacey, John Harvey and Katie for all joining in with that and giving us some answers. Now, everybody went into lots of detail and it's a huge fun read. So if you are on Facebook, go to the Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres Facebook group. If you're not already a member of it, type that into Facebook. You will find us easily enough. Join the group. At the moment, it's sitting there pretty near the top as one of the threads that where we've been discussing. There's some fantastic, fascinating stories in there. Couple of quick things. Katie, if I haven't seen you crop up in the feed, so if you're watching this back at a later point, Katie talks about the fact that she's only just got back into photography in her 40s, and I would say I didn't start doing my photography until my early 40s as well. So, you know, it's never too late to start. The other thing is the fascination of people's stories. And one of the things you realise, I can't remember who said it, but there is some kind of quote around, it's something like, everybody's lives are epic. And they really are. You know, nobody gets through life without things happening to them. And one of the most powerful ones, especially in the light of what's going on at the moment in world politics, Nuria was in fact a refugee from the Kosovo War back in the 90s. But she was a teacher, she good with languages, as a translator, was helping NATO with translations and stuff like that, and then it's actually there she met her husband. She now lives in Britain and works in Tesco's. So there you go. Even somebody, you know, you go to your local supermarket, everybody who works there, everybody you meet, everybody's got an amazing story. So yeah, I if you get the chance, go and read some of these. They're absolutely fascinating. Thanks to everybody for contributing to that. Melissa says, veterinarian was my goal, but in the US in those days, women had a hard time getting into vet school. Now most vet students in the US are women. Yeah, well, the world changes constantly. This is true. Right, okay. So next thing I want to move on to then is the critique section. So the critique is this place where it's your opportunity to send in an image for feedback. If you've got sticking points, if you've got an image where it's not quite working in the way you wanted it to, but you're not really sure why, or you're coming up with conflicting advice and you could really do with a bit of clarity, or you just want another eye on a photo because you think it kind of works, but then maybe it's not getting the response you want. I mean, periodically we get through some really interesting photos where people say, I love this photo, I put it in for the competitions, never does very well. Why are other people not reacting to the photo in the same way you're reacting to the photo? All these kind of things. Here's the place to do it. It's very difficult to get really good feedback on your photos on social media because you put your photos up on Facebook, all your friends say, love it, you're brilliant, fantastic, because they're being nice to you, regardless of whether the photo is any good. Maybe it is good, but maybe it's not. And even if it's not, you will still get the likes and the positive comments because your friends are being nice to you. And that's lovely because that's what friends should be doing. But it doesn't help you with your photography. So where can you get a bit of honest feedback? This is what this is about. So if you're on Facebook, go to the Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres Facebook group, stick your image in, let me know where your sticking points are and put it in for critique. Or if you don't do Facebook, email me, or you can see my web address here, kimayres.co.uk. So just kim@kimayres.co.uk. And again, let me know what your sticking point is, where your difficulties are, and I'll do my best to help. Now, this week, I only actually really got very few, basically I got one submission, and that's from Rosemary. So this has become a little bit of the Rosemary show, I think. However, let me talk about this. So Rosemary says, I wanted to do a bit of still life, and here is my attempt. So let me just find Rosemary's picture, and I'll pull it up and tell you what she says about it. So this is Rosemary's picture, and Rosemary says, a couple of days ago, I baked some sourdough blueberry muffins. Mouth-watering already. And they tasted so much like springtime. I wanted to capture that in a photo. The trick was that the light coming through the window was very dull and flat, requiring a diffused artificial light near the window. My question is whether the scene and the lighting in particular conveys the feeling of spring as much as it could. Okay, I'll carry on. I'll read the rest of it and then I'll come back to that. While setting up the scene, I tried to pay attention to all the things we've been learning about: complementary-ish colours, leading lines, repeating circular shapes, using contrast and brightness to draw the eye into the main subject. I planned the lemon slice to capture some of the light and suggest the sun, but hopefully it's neither too literal nor a distraction. Okay, right, so first of all, Rosemary, fantastic. I love the fact that you're bringing in all these ideas, that you've been thinking about them, how to construct them. The idea that somebody's actually been listening to what I've been saying and trying to take on board what I've been saying is wonderful. It's why I do these podcasts every week. So that's great. Now, okay, so let's address the first thing, which you say is your blueberry muffins reminded you of a sense of spring. You want to capture that sense of spring. Now, as I've talked about before, very often with photography, there's the photography which, if it does it for you, that's great, no problem. If that's all if you're only ever wanting it for you, then no problem. If, however, you have somebody else looking at these photos, if this photo is going to be put in front of somebody else, and you want them to experience the feelings and the mood and the idea and the concept and everything that you have, then you've got to start asking, is it going to do that? And if it's not, why not? What could you do differently? So the first thing, does this say springtime? Now, I have to say, to me, it doesn't say springtime because I don't have an association of blueberry muffins with spring. So it might be a cultural thing. It might be just that happens to be for your personal thing that, for you always got blueberry muffins in spring. I mean, for me, blueberries is one of those things, if you're talking, okay, these days we can quite often get fruit and vegetables from all around, any time of the year in our local supermarkets. But generally speaking, blueberries are a summer fruit. They come out after June, certainly here in the UK. Lemons, similarly, are an autumn kind of fruit. So summer and autumn fruits don't necessarily say spring to me. Now, lemon might say spring in the terms of, say, like Pancake Day, where we squeeze a bit of lemon on our pancakes, and there's a certain, so pancake day is usually kind of somewhere around February, March, so that always kind of feels, you know, yeah, there's a kind of a taste of that. But if you're talking about spring, for me, you might have, there might be particular fruits or foods or whatever. You would need to have something which was more kind of likely to be ripe or available naturally at this time of the year, or, you know, March or into maybe April if you're trying to catch ahead. So those kind of things. Now, I think actually, if you could have sitting in the background, slightly out of focus, some spring flowers. If you had a vase with some daffodils, certainly around here in this part of the UK, daffodils are very much a sign of spring flowers, or even crocuses. Snowdrops, we've still got snowdrops out at the moment. They tend to be first hint of spring, but it's still generally speaking winter. Primroses for me always conjure up the idea of Mother's Day. Now, I know Mother's Day in the UK is earlier in the year than it is in the US. So again, you've got these kind of cultural things. Now, it might be just what happened to your particular family, your particular experiences, or there can be whole cultural things that go on as well. So VG in India, for example, has talked before about the fact they don't really have, you don't have spring and autumn in the way that we do. They have dry season and wet season, which is a different kind of way of doing things. So these kind of cultural ideas, cultural norms, depending on how widespread the image is going to be. So if blueberry muffins always summers give you a sense of spring, then that's great. If they give a sense of spring to your family and your friends and your neighbourhood, then this photo would work. If it's going beyond that, though, travelling over to the UK, I don't think it does tend to have that sense of spring. So that's on. I wanted to bring that in as a kind of a cultural level, something to keep in mind when you're creating a photo. If you were putting this photo up on one of these sites like PhotoCrowd or Guru Shots, these kind of online photo competition sites, and there was a competition called Springtime, and you put this in, there would be an awful lot of people around the world who would just skim straight over this because it doesn't represent spring in, say, the same way that if you had a little vase of daffodils or crocuses or something like that in the background, that it might. So keep that one in mind. So the next thing then is about the notion of the composition. What else might you have done differently? So we look at this photo, and what we've got the blueberry muffin, yum, and it's looking very tasty, and it's nice and sharp, and here in the foreground we've got the focus on the blueberry muffin. In the background we've got a drink, not sure what the drink is, could be iced tea, could be apple juice. We've got a slice of lemon, although out of focus, we can still make out that it is. And as you say, maybe hinting at the idea of echoing the sun. So, what else could we have done, though, in order to think about alternative ways of doing the composition? One of the things I'm very struck with by this composition is it is very vertical. That the lemon sits almost directly above the muffin. And there's quite a chunk of a gap between the lemon and the muffin. Now, what it is, because you've got these two brighter circular areas, they're both vying for our attention. The lemon is trying to grab our attention because we've got a bright light circle against a mid-tone background. The muffin is trying to grab our attention because we've got a bright oval shape against a mid-toned background, also above a little bit of shadow, and it's in focus. So our eye is wanting to get drawn to the focus part, but our eye is also getting caught where there is contrast in tone. Then we've also got quite a strong orange in the drink, which is also, so a strong colour like orange is also one of these which is grabbing our attention. So our attention is getting pulled in several directions at the same time. And therefore, I think the composition doesn't necessarily work as strongly as it could. Ideally, what you're wanting is to be able to draw the eye through the composition. And also, when you've got that jump, when the eye's got to jump from one part of the picture, the lemon, to the muffin, or vice versa, and back up again, it feels like we're getting pulled in two directions at the same time. Does that make sense? Let's just open this with Photoshop for a sec. Not that I'm entirely sure what I'm going to do with it in Photoshop, but okay, let's just close some of these noise-related mannequin images. At some point, I'm going to have to find a name for that mannequin so I can just refer to it by name. Maybe that should be a name the mannequin competition. Right, so we've got this layout. Now, how else could we do it? Now, I was tempted to sort of start cutting out in Photoshop and moving things about, but the problem is we have background and stuff as well. I'm now going to attempt very bad drawing just to try and get a point across. So let's create a new document, and what we'll do is we'll just create something which is, 1200 by 900, that'll do. I'm going to create a little pencil tool, and what I will do on a new one layer, let's create the muffin. Okay, let's just make that a little bit smaller. And so what I'm going to do is we're going to have our very badly drawn muffin on a plate with a few blueberries kicking about. And then on another one, we're going to have your tall glass, and we'll have the lemon within it. Okay. Now, actually, what I meant to do was do that on a separate and I'll show you why in a moment. So we've got our lemon on a glass, we've got our muffin kicking about. And then what we do, because we've got these on separate ones, I can then move these around the screen a bit. So we can drag that over here, we can drag that over here, and I'll tell you what, I will just with the white, I will fill in that that muffin. I'll fill in, oh, I didn't need to do that. I'll fill in those bits there and come back here and fill in those bits there as well. Yep, I think hopefully I filled the right bits. So what we can do now, your current setup, more or less, is something like this. Let's just take a quick look. Yeah, more or less. Now there's a bit of table in the way as well. But what we can see here is we've got this jump from one part to another. Now, if you were to have them more like that, I think we end up with something slightly more pleasing in a diagonal. There's a sort of sense of movement that goes beyond this. And then the next thing is maybe having the lights coming down. Now, when we look at yours, your picture here, now, slight little detail. You said because the light wasn't very good coming through. Now, you could have just used natural window light. Maybe if your camera was on a tripod, you could have slowed the shutter speed down to allow the softness of the natural light to come in. If, on the other hand, you were wanting that sense of a shaft of sunlight coming in, then you would have actually needed a harder light. You wouldn't have actually had the diffuser. So you could either use the flash directly, or you could use the flash and you could use some little bit of shadowing. And one of the things you might want, if you wanted to have it looking like it was coming through the window, would be some kind of dark area. So if we, let's say you've got, sorry, I've got to turn that round. So if you had a shaft of light where you've got shadow coming down in the background. Now, okay, let's do one more here, and we'll just create a table and fill that. So what you can see here is that if there was a shaft of sunlight and we had a shaft of shadow, then, and it's coming down kind of, so you're creating a kind of 90-degree or a kind of a cross angle. So your cup and your glass, your muffin and your glass are kind of diagonal to each other. You want the shaft of light coming down almost perpendicular to it. That's creating quite an interesting sense of shadow as well. On top of that, these themselves would have harder shadows. So you might have, that might have a shadow, that might have a shadow, and then of course it would be shadowed on one side of these as well. Also, if you had the light cutting through the glass might create some interesting kind of patterns shooting off it as well, and might even create some interesting shadows. So for that though, you would need a hard light, and like I say, this is maybe where you would use a flash, off-camera flash, but without any modifier on it, in order to create that hard line shadow. And I think that way, if you've got that angle, that then looks like sunlight coming through the window. And in a way, I think that if you're talking about that idea of trying to get a sense of spring, and we're thinking spring and sunshine, you're needing to look at ways you can emulate the sunshine in the lighting that you're using. So to kind of sum up on that then, with your picture, it's that idea, I think a sort of a diagonal layout works better than a direct horizontal layout. It means that there's maybe less jump from one to the other where you're going between the lemon and the muffin. If you kind of pull it down and to the right a bit or to the left a bit, you've got a slightly more pleasing diagonal kind of layout to it. And then you need to be thinking about your lighting. If you're wanting soft window light, which is still always going to be slightly better than a diffused flash, then you arrange it side on to the window and just do a slower shutter speed until such time as you've got enough light coming into the sensor. Other than that, if you want to emulate sunlight, then actually just try the flash without a diffuser. Maybe even stick the flash outside the window if you've got it on a tripod or a stand, or you've got a partner or a kid to go and stand out there, hold it for you. And sometimes it's worth, just out of shot, to play around with bits of cardboard, maybe to create shadows, so you can create like a diagonal line of shadow on the wall behind, or the cloth behind the picture. So I hope that gives you some ideas, Rosemary. Ways of playing. I think it's brilliant. It's a great start. You've really put some thought into this photo. Now, hopefully the ideas I've given you, you can kind of go off and explore other options. But thank you very much for sending that one in. Okay, what else have we? We've got a few comments in here. Oh, Melissa says, yep, live for the likes, but you're so right. Friends like everything I put on Facebook. April says, I like it already. Great composition, but does not look especially like spring. Pat wonders if the lemon could be more zingier. I think for that, Pat, what you would do is make more of a feature of the lemon, bringing it into the foreground. But if she brightens it too much, it then detracts more from the muffin. So the question here is, which is the primary story and which is the supporting actor? If the primary story is about the muffin and the lemon is kind of a supporting role, you've got to be careful that it's there, but it's not overpowering the muffin. And at the moment, the brightness, it kind of feels equivalent rather than softer. So that's kind of where the problem comes in, I think. Yeah, Melissa's saying add a vase of spring flowers. So's April. Pat's saying spring lambs. I think it would be harder to get a lamb on the table, to be honest, Pat. Rosemary says, thank you for all the suggestions of flowers. Daffodils or forget-me-nots would also fit the colour scheme. I'll have to retake this when ours are in bloom. And it's another excuse for baking. Never need an excuse for baking. April says, how about landscape instead of portrait? Well, I think we then went into the playing around with my little very rough sketches. I'm a photographer, not an artist, or sketch artist. Stacey said, will work if you went a little above or another angle. I think, again, that's how we were playing with it. Oh, Pat thinks my mannequin should be called Woody. Stacey says, muffin looks good. Diane says, going back to ISO, Kim, I did some shooting at a riding club last Saturday indoors. I had my ISO up to 400 and changed the white balance to fluorescent. Right, okay. So are you telling me that that worked or that you ran into difficulties? If you want to follow up with that one, Diane, so that I know whether you're telling us a solution or whether you're saying that you ran into a problem and you wondering what the help might, what it could have been. I think, yeah, certainly if you're doing indoors, I mean, the notion of white balance is a slightly different thing. But yeah, ISO 400 is probably fine under most circumstances, as long as you can get the shutter speed. If you're at a riding club, your tricky thing is presumably most of the people are moving, and that's what you're going to be up against. So you need to get the shutter speed up. That might result in a higher ISO, but if you can get away with 400, then that's great. Rosemary says, I love drawing with angles and shadows. I was afraid that that my light was maybe too medium. Such helpful points. Eager to try reshooting. Excellent. Well, I'm glad that's useful. Okay, a couple more bits and pieces. Comments about the muffins being delicious. April says, I had insomnia last night. Was actually thinking about still life ideas, the very elements we're thinking about in this podcast. Well, there you go. Oh, Meg says, makes me hungry just now with the muffin. Yeah, I think that's kind of doing that to all of us, Meg. April was also thinking of Woody. Diane says, yes, I took a sample at 100 first and there was jumping. So yes, you had to increase the ISO in order to capture. I mean, jumping horses, you might find that your shutter speed is really having to get quite high in order to be able to capture them. But so much depends on how much available light you have. And Robert comes in and says, I like the idea of drawing out the picture before shooting it. Yeah, that can very often help. It depends on... Some people are very visual people, some people are not very visual people, some people find... I mean, sometimes if I'm going to be doing a particularly complex shoot and a particularly important shoot, very often I will do sketches. Now, my sketches are Pin Man sketches, you know, I mean, they're really basic... I mean, you've just seen the sketches that I've just been doing, you know, I mean, I'm not trying to win any prizes for my sketching. But it doesn't have to be, as long as there's just enough for you to be able to go, okay, I know what I was talking about there. That actually roughly having this over here and this over here, that bit lower, higher and that bit lower, that bit further back and a bit smaller, helps me to get a sense of the balance of what I'm going to do. So if you're going to be constructing a photo in advance, especially if you're not totally sure what circumstances you're going to be hit with when you arrive to take the photo, then doing sketches can really help. But otherwise, if you're taking it with the camera and you're arranging a still life on a table, very much you can go click and then just start moving things about until you feel like that is working and it's falling into place. Right. Okay, I think that's pretty much us. We're at 4 o'clock. Now, next week, importantly, next week is episode 100. And so what I decided I'm going to do for episode 100 is, this is a challenge. I want you to send me your absolute showstoppers, your absolute best photo ever, right? No excuses, no, well, I like this, but... no thought of, it would have been okay, but the lighting wasn't quite right. Or, you know, I'm not talking about photos for critique. I'm talking about the photo which, let's imagine that in 100 years' time, somebody could come across one photo of yours, and it's the only photo of yours that represents, and they're going to decide entirely on who you are based on this one photo. What photo do you want? What photo do you want to show off? What photo do you want them going, oh, he was a pretty good photographer, or she was a pretty good photographer back then? So I want to see your absolute showstopper photo. And then so next week for our 100th podcast. God, when I started doing this in April 2020, I thought I'll do this for 3 months and see how it goes. So that would have been 13 episodes. Here we are, episode 100. So I really want you to show off. I want you to give me the best photo you've ever taken and tell me why it's your best as well. You know, has this won awards? Has it just done really well in some of the online competitions? Is it the one where all your friends said, oh yeah, I really love this, and not just a handful of likes, but everybody just went crazy for it? But I do want it to be really photographically interesting. Not just, I love this photo because it's a picture of my grandchild and I know it's a bit out of focus, but hey, I love my grandchild. I want it to be as everything you know about photography, everything you've ever practiced about photography. What's your photo where it just feels like this is the one that's above and beyond? Okay, I really want to see your best photo. And then next week we'll go through, we'll take a look at what everybody sent in. We'll throw a few smug points around and we'll have some real fun and see if we can inspire each other with what we're capable of doing. So really hoping that you send your images, post them into the Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres Facebook group. If you don't do Facebook, email them to me, but tell me a little bit about the photo as well. I don't need vast essays on it, but a paragraph, two or three sentences on what the photo is and why you consider it your best, or why this is the one you would like to be remembered as, you know, this is your finest photography. So that, I'm really looking forward to that. And a little heads up, in 4 weeks' time, episode 104, is going to be the second anniversary, 2 years. And in 2 years' time, or rather the second anniversary, I've decided I'm going to do Smug Awards. We're going to have a Smug Award ceremony. Now, I'm not entirely sure what shape that will take. I'm going to try and develop this over the next couple of weeks. I might put something into the Facebook group asking people questions about what they feel would be a good idea for Smug Awards. But anyway, I will talk about maybe that a little bit more next week or the week after. The main thing to remember is that next week, 100th, show your best ever photo. I can see comments flying up here. What have we got? Oh, yeah, so Karen's saying congrats on 100 episodes. Diane says any subject. Yes, absolutely, any subject. It just has to be photographically good. Like I say, don't give me a picture of a baby hedgehog that's out of focus because it's a cute baby hedgehog, but I want to see good photography where you've got the skills. So it needs to be in focus and it needs to have some kind of aesthetic quality to it. April says, everyone have a great week, or next week, hard challenge. No, it goes through. Now, I suppose part of what makes it a hard challenge is sometimes is finding the one. Because we all have, we'll have different favourites for different reasons. But this is part, and it is a challenge. The challenge is to say, well, okay, which is the one? So if you narrowed it down to 4, and you go, I really don't know. Supposing there's a gun to your head, supposing that the house is on fire, you can just rescue one photo. Which one is it going to be? It's that kind of level that I want. Diane says, I think you need a medal kit. Well, if anybody wants to make me a medal or send me a virtual medal on on Facebook, I will accept them. What else I've got? Oh, Stacey says, your podcasts are inspiring and I enjoy sharing experiences of others. You're good at critiques. Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Stacey. Oh, Rosemary says, congratulations on making it 100. Excellent. Good. So, I think this is all fun. Like I say, last thing here, if you're finding these useful, inspiring, interesting, entertaining, buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres. Always a good way to support these podcasts. So next week, look forward to seeing you all. Look forward to seeing your fantastic photos. Try not to leave it till Saturday to send them. Please send them to me through the week if you can, ideally to reach by Friday. Trying to put these podcasts together. If everything's left to the last minute, something's going to get left out. Right. Okay. Have fun, everyone. Thank you very much for turning up. Thank you to everyone. Thank you to Rosemary, particularly this week, for first of all putting in the question about ISO, which inspired this podcast, and also for a really interesting critique image. Right. Okay. Enjoy your blueberry muffins, your cups of tea, your springtime beverages. Right. Cheerio. Bye bye.